There are two anointed ones spoken here in these passages at the end of Daniel 9. There's one anointed one who comes after 7 weeks, which means after 49 years, namely that's Cyrus. How do you know? Because Tovia says it? Forget Tovia. Look at Isaiah 45, verse 1. Cyrus is God's Messiah, God's Mashiach. It says it explicitly. But only here in Daniel 9 do they translate the word Mashiach as Messiah, and it goes further. They then capitalize the word Messiah. Open up your King James right now. Open up your New American Standard right now. Open up your new NIV right now. A Messiah is capitalized. Now, here is the ultimate brain, just a brain screw. And that is, there is no such thing as a capital letter in the Hebrew language. In Isaiah 45, verse 1, do you think that the word anointed is capitalized or not capitalized? Until an anointed one, a prince, the Messiah, the prince, how the King James translated, would be 7 weeks. Stop. There's a semicolon there. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to open up a modern King James. That means not the 1611. Let's go to the one that was just published yesterday. Okay. And notice.
Wow.
And then so what happened? This is mind blowing. I mean, your frontal lobe should be shooting through your cerebellum, and I don't even know what I just said.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm with Rabbi Tovia Singer now, back by popular demand as always. You know, after a couple of weeks, people start asking in the comment section, "Where's the rabbi? Where's he been?"
I know.
So
I know.
I do what I'm told. You know, no. But anyways, I want to talk to you about Daniel and this. So, like I said before, last time you were on, I get these emails from people. And they watch you, and they're listening intently, and they want to learn. I'm like, oh, you guys are making good points. These are unfalsifiable points you're making. We can look these up. We can check the Hebrew, and sure enough, you guys are right. But, and I always get these. You always get these buts, and then there's a couple more questions tackled on. It's like, okay, Isaiah 53. Okay, you're right. It's the suffering servants Israel. We got it. You guys are right. All right, and they'll say like, okay, the virgin thing, you guys are right about that. Okay, whatever, you're right. You know, Alma, Betula, you got that. But now I got you in check now. I'm like, okay, what is it now? Daniel 9. Who else could Daniel be talking about when he talks about the 70 weeks? The anointed one will be cut down.
Right.
It's so clear that that's Jesus. So I'm going to throw it right over to you. You can take as much time as you need. Explain to us what this means and how does it get so misinterpreted?
It should be said from the outset that if someone concedes Isaiah 53, which they would have to, as you said, the context demands it, and concedes Isaiah chapter 7 is not talking about the birth of a Messiah 700 years later, you then can throw the New Testament in the place that it belongs, the garbage, because that demonstrates that Matthew was misappropriating passages from the Hebrew Bible, and both Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 53 are used in the New Testament. Philip famously uses that with the eunuch from Gaza, and Matthew 1:23. But Daniel 9, you're right, stands out alone, very, very unique, because Christians will say, Daniel 9 is very different here, because here we have a precise prediction of exactly when the Messiah is going to be killed, going to be crucified. We have the timing. It is perfectly set up and is outlined in the last 4 passages of the 9th chapter of Daniel. How could you deny Christ? Now, what's very striking about this I brought up the Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 7, not just because you did, but there's something very striking about Daniel 9. And that is the writers of the New Testament did not consider that to be very important. In fact, nowhere in the Christian Bible did the authors think or record that Daniel 9 predicts the date of the Messiah's death. I mean, you would have to believe that Paul knew that Daniel 9 predicted that the Messiah would be cut off, killed after 70 weeks, and Paul just didn't think that was important enough to mention. You'd have to believe that the writers of all four Gospels and the letters of Peter and John, no one thought it was important enough. So it's mentioned nowhere, and in a moment, you're going to understand why. There's probably no text in the Hebrew Scriptures that has been mangled more extensively than the 9th chapter of Daniel. And we're going to talk about what's going on there. Daniel is using a unit of time that you, the viewer, need to know before we can get started. And that is, he's using terms of days and weeks to represent years. So a week in Daniel 9 is meant to represent 7 years. So 70 weeks is 490 years. And what the church had to do was to alter the last 4 passages of Daniel 9 in order to make it look like the Messiah is going to come and he's going to be cut off and he's going to be killed before the destruction of the Second Temple. This is exactly how it's going to be presented to you. But in order to accomplish this feat, they had to change the text. Now, one point your viewers must understand: if you don't get this, you're going to be lost. The word Mashiach, anointed, Messiah, is mentioned 39 times in the Hebrew Bible. 39 times does that word appear. As it turns out, it is never referring to the Messiah who we refer to as the Messiah. Never. It refers to, that's right. So this is like a huge surprise. If you don't get this, you're not going to get anything. The word appears in the book of Leviticus more frequently than any other, and there it's referring to priests, Kohanim. I'm a descendant of Aaron, so people from my tribe, from my family line, are called anointed. Now, in every other instance in the Hebrew Bible where the word Mashiach appears, the Christian Bibles, the King James, the New International Version, all of them line up all the usual characters, correctly translate the word Mashiach as anointed. But only here in Daniel 9 do they translate the word Mashiach as Messiah, and it goes further. They then capitalize the word Messiah. Open up your King James right now. Open up your New American Standard right now. Open up your new NIV right now. Messiah is capitalized. Now, here is the ultimate brain, just the brain screw. And that is, there is no such thing as a capital letter in the Hebrew language.
I found that out the hard way. When I started looking into Hebrew, I said, wait. Where's the capitalized? There's no capitalized. No way. And then I was like, okay, that changes a lot of things.
You know, people wonder why I care about Christians so much and why don't I get angry when I interact with Christians. The reason I don't is I feel so sorry for them. My heart goes out to them. And if I was in their predicament, that means I read no Hebrew. I didn't say a word of Hebrew. Even though Christians firmly believe that the Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, was originally written in Hebrew / there's a little Aramaic, but they believe that the Hebrew is the word of God, but they can't read a word of it, and they are utterly dependent on the translators, so much so, and you know this, Christians argue over which is the right translation, and there's some Christians that believe that only the King James, like what, I mean, if it was good enough for Peter, it was good enough. We know all the silliness, but this is why Christians are so easily victimized here is because they're reading Daniel 9 and it says Messiah, capital M, and it gets worse. The Hebrew is Mashiach. What the King James does is they amp it up and they put in the definite article, the Messiah. There is no definite article in the Hebrew. So therefore, when you're reading a Christian Bible, you're reading a commentary. You're reading a human iteration. And this is not just any translation. Any translation is a human commentary. But in the case of the Christian Bibles and the fundamentalist Christian Bibles, you're reading a corruption. And just for a moment, just so you know, I want to tip my hat to the normal Christians, the mainline Christians. The Revised Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version does not engage in this
you're right.
idiotic process. They're straight ahead on this.
And by the way, the King James only people, who was the tribe I came from, they thought these were demonic Bibles because they were correct. They think that Satan corrupted these Bibles. And I used to go along with this because this is what the pastor would tell me. Go pull out your NIV. Look, it says "in anointed," and it's not even in capital. It's "the anointed." Look at your King James. See, they changed it. And then I did the courageous thing, the thing that you're not supposed to do, is I went online and looked up the Hebrew, looked up the manuscripts, looked up the Septuagint, and tried to check them all out. Just wanted to compare them all. Found out that there is no "the," there's no capital M. It's "in anointed." It's somebody who's anointed as a priest. That's what it means.
This is going to loom very large here. And, I'm going to say this to you. I can't think of another theological conversation where what I'm about to share with you is going to come up. So when people say they only follow the King James only people, so most people see that as completely insane. The King James commissioned this translation in 1607. 47 people ultimately completed in 1611. And people really think today that when they're reading a King James Bible, that they're reading the 1611. If you had a 1611, which you can buy online, it's available.
There was over 400 changes done from 1611 to like 1807 or something like that.
Right, and then there's another massive, and that's because the language changes,
right?
The grammar. I mean, when in 1607, the English is called a Jacobean English. You can make it out, but it's Jacobean English. It's not Chaucer. It's readable, but it's definitely not our King James. So the King James has gone through numerous revisions because grammar's updated, words are updated. The colon, semicolon just came into fashion. I mean, think of it this way. The King James Version was published just a dozen years after Shakespeare published The Merchant of Venice. Right. Okay, this is really going back in time. Yeah. So which King James are you referring to? Now, the viewer might think that I'm just sort of poking something at people who are King James only. I wouldn't waste my time with this, but this is going to become humongous in just a moment. So what Christians are saying is that, look, there are 70 weeks that are decreed upon the people and the holy city, and then 6 things to terminate transgression and sin, to wipe away iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, and to seal the vision of the prophet, and to anoint the most holy. 6 things. And know and comprehend. Now, in a King James Bible, it'll read that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem until the Messiah, capital M, the Prince, capital P, it's insanity, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which means 62 weeks. How much? 7, 60, and 2? 69 weeks. And what will happen then? The streets will be rebuilt, street and moat, but in troublous times. Verse 26, after the 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, okay? So they're saying, here we have a clear prediction of Christ crucified, what Paul preached. Now let's go back. And I think the key question to ask a Christian, I've done this in many live debates that on YouTube, where I've asked the Christian, like, what is your calculation? When do you start when do you start counting these 490 years? Like, and Christians just have no idea.
No idea.
That's the key. I've stood in huge audiences all over the world, and when Christians ask me about Daniel 9, I've always asked the simple question: if there's a 490-year period or a 483 period, 8-year period, because there's 69 weeks, at when do you start counting, and why do you start counting them? And Christians just completely shut down. They have no idea. They're not bad people. They're just never taught this. Their pastors are not evil. Their pastors have no clue. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually unpack what's happening here, because there's one other thing that Christians don't know. We've gone through this before when we've talked about Isaiah 7:14. Ask a Christian, what does it say in Isaiah 7:13? What is the context? When you read Isaiah 53, what does it say in Isaiah 52? And Christians just go, the lights go out. So what is happening here in Daniel 9? Daniel is in an extraordinary predicament. Here's a prophet that is standing. This is how Daniel 9 begins. In the first year of Darius the Mede. Why is that significant? If you don't know why that's meaningful, you can pack up and go home. What does that mean? There is a prayer. Daniel is crying to God. He feels like the Jewish people are in an enormous amount of trouble, and you have no idea how serious the problem that Daniel's confronting. And I'm just unpacking Daniel chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. Daniel is standing at a time when the Babylonian Empire has just collapsed. Historians to this day are hard-pressed to explain how this could have happened. We talk about Babylonian Empire, you think about the United States. This was a massive empire. Like, how did it collapse? And the Persian Empire suddenly explodes into a massive empire. How did it happen? To this day, historians are hard-pressed to explain how that could have happened.
Yep.
But Daniel is looking at two passages in Jeremiah. If you don't know this, you can't possibly understand Daniel 9. The first passage is Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 12. It's a passage that looks very similar to Daniel chapter 29, verse 10, because both of them talk about a redemption of the Jewish people, fall of Babylon, and they seem to be predicting the same exact thing. Daniel chapter 25, verse 12, Jeremiah is speaking, and he's conveying that the Babylonian Empire will collapse after 70 years. The audience needs to just understand this, because if you don't understand what's going on in this passage, Jeremiah is trying to convince the Jewish people not to rebel against Babylon. That's a huge part of the book of Jeremiah. People are saying, let's fight against the Babylonians. And Jeremiah is saying, God is not on your side. And if you do fight against Babylon, God is not going to be with you. And in fact, they didn't listen to Jeremiah. And moreover, Jeremiah says, the Babylonian Empire only has 70 years. So if you just shut up and wait it out, they're going to be gone. That's the message of Jeremiah 25, verse 12, and that's the context. There is another passage, which I'll read to you, in Jeremiah 29, verse 10. And this is what Daniel is struggling with in that opening passage of Daniel 9. In Jeremiah 29:10, it says, "For thus saith the Lord, at the completion of 70 years of Babylon, I will remember you. I will fulfill my good word toward you to restore you to this place." It seems identical. So imagine Daniel is standing there, the unthinkable, the Soviet Union, a massive empire, collapses. The Babylon Empire, your nemesis, collapses. But nothing's happening. The Jews are not going back. Darius the Mede has emerged. That means the Persian Empire has begun.
Right.
And the Jews are not going back. And Daniel is going, oh my Lord, This is ominous. Daniel begins to think, and this is in the text in Daniel 9, begins to imagine that, whoa, the curse of Leviticus chapter 26, verse 18, which says, if you sin against me and continue to sin, I'll multiply your punishment 7 times, has emerged. And in fact, instead of a 70-year exile, there's perhaps a 490-year exile. And that's what he's struggling with. The angel Gabriel comes to explain to Daniel what is actually happening here. I need one other short history lesson. It's fascinating.
Oh, hey, I love it.
Okay, so I need you, the viewer, to listen like you've never listened in your life. This is a critical history lesson. We are talking about Solomon's temple that stood for 410 years. History lesson you must understand or you can't approach this text. 19 years prior to the destruction of the first temple, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire emerged. Pow! A massive empire emerged. It changes everything, okay? So that's 19 years prior to the destruction of the first temple. In the very next year, which is now 18 years before the destruction of the first temple, Nebuchadnezzar, who's called Nebuchadnezzar, I think in the anglicized version, Nebuchadnezzar invades the land of Israel and he subjugates Jerusalem, which means the land of Israel becomes a vassal state of the Babylonian Empire. Very critical. Nebuchadnezzar then will seek to extract, he doesn't want to destroy a temple at that point. He doesn't want to do any of those things. He just wants the Jews to give taxes to him and be loyal to him and give up on any idea of rebellion. These kings, usually, they're not like Nazis. They just wanted to kill. This is no genocide. He just wanted the Jews to say, for them to say, okay, we surrender, and we are now going to, it's like the Russians in Ukraine, just surrender, say, take it over, and you're now under the Russian Empire, okay? It's the same exact idea. The Jews don't want to listen to Nebuchadnezzar. As any people, they would fight for their independence, and Nebuchadnezzar then begins waves of expulsion of Jews, multiple waves of expulsion of Jewish people during these 18 years, and the Jews continue to rebel. Jeremiah pleads with them, don't rebel, but bear this in mind. From 18 years prior to the destruction of the first temple, Jerusalem already is a vassal state of the Babylonian Empire. There is no independence any longer. Now listen carefully. In the 19th year from the Babylonian Empire, the first temple is totally destroyed and almost all the Jews are exiled to Babylon. A small number goes to Egypt, but that's not germane right now. The first temple, Solomon's temple, is utterly destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. Here's one other key element, a date you must know. For 50 years, from the time the first temple was destroyed until the Persian Empire emerges, which means Darius the Mede, a very brief interlude, but then Cyrus the Great, is 50 years, a 50-year period spans from the destruction of the first temple until the emergence of the Persian Empire, with Cyrus, who God calls his Messiah. I'm giving you a wink, I'm giving you a hint of what's going on there. Back in Isaiah 45, says that Cyrus, who was a king, who was an anointed prince, literally in Isaiah 45, Cyrus gives the command for the Jews to return back to Jerusalem and to rebuild it, okay? So therefore, here's the key. If you're Daniel and you're standing at when the Babylonian Empire is collapsed, but the Jews have not returning because it's Darius the Mede, you're counting 70 years from when? 70 years from the emergence of the Babylonian Empire, which means you just passed the 69th year. And you're going, okay, one part of this prophecy has been fulfilled, but we're not going back. It's like you can hear crickets in the background. Like, what's going on? Like part one of prophecy is fulfilled, but part 2 isn't fulfilled. The angel Gabriel is there to explain to Daniel that, in fact, these 2 70-year periods of Jeremiah 25, verse 12, and 29, verse 10, are 2 different 70-year periods, because the Babylonian exile, that means from the time the first temple was destroyed until the second temple is built under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Yeshua ben Yotzadok, that's 70 years. So therefore, there are 2 70-year periods that overlap with each other, and the overlap is 50 years. And now we can understand what's happening. So Daniel is pouring out his guts and going, please, Lord, have mercy on us. Let us go back to our land. Let not this terrible curse come upon us, articulated in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 19. So the text actually reads, and I'm going now to chapter 9, verse 25. You should know and understand from the going forth of the word. What does that mean, from the going forth of the word? We know that from Daniel chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. That means from the destruction of Jerusalem to return and rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed prince, the Hebrew is Ad Mashiach Nagid, will be Shavuim Shiva, 7 weeks. How long is 7 weeks? Remember what I told you, each day is a year. I'm not going to go into why they're using, there's a reason why each day is a year in Daniel 9. It's not the only place. It's very similar to Leviticus chapter 25. If you know what that means, great. If not, I don't want to overload you with information. 7 weeks, which means 49 years will pass from the destruction of the first temple until an anointed prince, Ad Mashiach Nagid. 7 weeks. That's 49 years. Remember what I told you? From the destruction of the first temple until Cyrus gives the command. See the opening passages of Ezra. This is why the Christian Bibles take the book of Ezra and they shove it away from the end of Daniel. Because they don't want you to see. That's why they mix up the order.
They mix it up. Yeah, they really do. Yeah.
Right. In a Jewish Bible, after you finish Daniel, go to Ezra. That's a nightmare for the church. Because if you finish Daniel, remember, Daniel is only 12 chapters, and then you open up Ezra. What does Ezra begin with? The book of Ezra begins not with Ezra. My friends, boys and girls, in the book of Ezra, we're not introduced to Ezra until chapter 7. Ezra begins chapter 1, verse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in a pronouncement of Cyrus the Great saying, Jews, I have a word from God. You need to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. You've got to rebuild your temple, and I have it on word from God. Why is Cyrus saying that? Because he has a 200-year-old prophecy from Isaiah. And he's saying, I have it on God that I've got to send you back. So therefore, what it says there is from the going forth of the word. The word is the word of prophecy, of L'charvot Yerushalayim. See Daniel 9, verse 1 and 2. From the destruction of the first temple until Cyrus the Great. Who is Cyrus the Great? He is he's not just anointed, but he's a prince. Now, how do you know I'm telling you the truth? My friends, all you have to do is go to Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, and Isaiah 45, verse 1. That's where the chapter break is. That chapter break is completely artificial. Who says to Cyrus, says Isaiah 44, verse 28, he is my shepherd, all my desire will be fulfilled in him, to say to Jerusalem, it shall be built, and the temple shall be founded. So says the Lord, L'Mashiach L'Choresh. I want to say that again, and you can open up your King James Christ Day Bible with 15 crosses on it. It doesn't make a difference which one you use. It will say, to my anointed, to Cyrus. Yeah. The Hebrew is Mashiach. And interestingly, my friends, take a guess before you look it up. In Isaiah 45, the exact same Hebrew word, Mashiach, the Mashiach, to his anointed. Do you think in a king, based on what I've told you, in Isaiah 45, verse 1, do you think that the word anointed is capitalized or not capitalized?
In the King James?
In the anything. In
obviously
the Jesus
not.
Christ, right. In the Christ, Jesus Christ,
yeah, they're not
Mary,
going to capitalize
Mother
that.
of God.
Yeah. Which it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be
right.
capitalized
That is,
anywhere.
which is it? It's the same Hebrew word. Why
Right.
are you doing? Why are you messing with you Christians?
You're right. That's exactly true. They're messing with the text.
You Christians, I say this with love. You need to go back to your church and demand a refund. You need to pull your kid. You're being lied to. I mean, you need to ask your pastor, why does the exact same Hebrew word, which appears in Isaiah 45, is translated as anointed with no capital A, and why don't you translate it as Messiah in Isaiah 45, verse 1? Listen. Please, if you doubt what I'm saying, ask your pastor, ask any Christian apologist, why does the King James Bible, why does the King James translate the word Mashiach in Isaiah 45 as anointed, but for some reason in Daniel 9 as Messiah? Like, what are you doing? It's the same Hebrew word. Could you explain that? Because if you can't explain it, I'm out. If you can't explain it, I put a lot of money in that plate they pass around, and I'm out of here. And I'm leaving skid marks, and I'm pulling my kids out of this Christian school. And I'm going to start teaching my kids Hebrew.
That is another prime example of somebody taking the word Betula and changing it into, or I'm sorry, Alma, and making that virgin. But then in other places in the text where the same word is used, they don't use that. Right. So they're doing it again. They're finding somewhere in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where they need to emphasize certain words that have to be Christ-like, capital M, Messiah. But the same words used earlier in a different book to describe the same person. Isaiah and Daniel talk about the same person, and it's capital, it's lowercase a, anointed. It's the same word. Messiah is anointed. That's the same word. It's the Christ. Right. If in Greek, it should say Christ, the christened one.
Right. I mean, although we have, right. That means, why are you deliberately translating the exact same word in one? You're rendering it as them, and you put the definite article there, stuff a capital letter there. Just please don't let your pastor or priest or Christian apostle, whoever it is, don't let them change the topic. Okay, you got to try. I need an answer, and if you don't get a satisfying answer, I think it's time for you just to consider what's happening to you. This is why I care, because I know if I grew up in a Christian home, I don't know if I'd figure this thing out. I don't know, because I wasn't. If I grew up in a Christian home in Oklahoma, I wouldn't be taught biblical Hebrew. If I was brought up in a Christian home in Kansas, they don't teach. Kansas is pretty conservative. A lot of evangelicals there. None of their schools for 9-year-olds are taught Hebrew. When I was 9 years old, I could read Hebrew like you read a newspaper. I mean, I wasn't just a spectacular student. I was very average. Any Orthodox kid, we learn Hebrew. I mean, we're just reading it straight through. And it's really easy. It's a small language. It gets crazier than this. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the final answer first, and then we're going to back up. There are two anointed ones spoken here in these passages at the end of Daniel 9. There's one anointed one who comes after 7 weeks, which means after 49 years, namely that's Cyrus. How do you know? Because Tovia says it? Forget Tovia. Look at Isaiah 45, verse 1. Cyrus is God's Messiah, God's Mashiach. It says it explicitly. And then there's a subsequent anointed one who was cut off. He's not called a prince anymore after 62 weeks. Now, I'm going to give you the answer now, and then we can backpedal this. The distance from the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second temple is 490 years. 70-year exile, 420 for the length of the second temple period. Listen very carefully, when does the priesthood get cut off and the temple get shut down? At the end of the second temple period, when the Jews go to war with Rome. When does the war with Rome commence?
66.
66, which is how long? It's a half a week. From 66 to 70 is how long? It's 3.5 years.
Right.
Bingo. There is your half a week. So what happened? This is mind blowing. I mean, your frontal lobe should be shooting through your cerebellum. And I don't even know what I just said. So in 66, what happens? The Jews go to war with Rome. It's a horrible, bloody war. The temple is surrounded. I'm a priest. That means I'm a direct descendant of Aaron. My father going back. Today, just so you understand this, although there are many rules that govern my life, and that is distinct from other Jewish people. As an example, I can't come into contact with a dead person. It's forbidden to me. There are rules that apply to me, okay? But I can't bring sacrifices. I can't work in the temple because there is no temple. That means when the Jews go to war with Rome, the whole temple gets shut down. Everything becomes isolated. It becomes instead of a no-fly zone, it becomes a no-sacrifice zone. So then an anointed one is cut off. That's the priesthood. That means there are 130 commandments in the Torah out of 613 associated with sacrifices. Bingo, that's cut off. The word yikares, Mashiach, means an anointed one, means kares doesn't mean killed. Now, it could be if someone's cut off or it could be removed, it could be they're killed, but it doesn't mean. There are many ways. You could say, Yahareg Mashiach. That's how you would say Messiah is killed. Kares is removed. Literally, the root of the word means removed. Now, what does the Christian do with this? Because they want only one Messiah. And what they do, this tiny complicated, my apologies to you beforehand, but you need to know these numbers or you'll never understand Daniel 9. Daniel 9 is describing two anointed ones. One that comes after 49 years, after 7 weeks, and that's Cyrus, and a second subsequent anointed one, but he's not a prince. He's not Cyrus. He's coming 62 weeks later, which is 434 years. That's 3.5 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, and he is removed. The church hates this. They need to have both anointed ones as the same, and this is where it gets interesting. So if you're looking at a Christian Bible, whatever, it's going to make it appear as though the period of time is 7, 60, and 2. So the text is going to read, the Messiah, the Prince, in a King James, shall be from going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks, comma, and 62 weeks, which means 62 weeks. That means it sounds like the text is saying 69 weeks, but it's breaking it up into a weird way. That means it puts a comma there, but there's no comma there. It should be a complete semicolon there. This is where the King James Version is gonna blow your mind out the window. That means in any language, the way you say 69 is 60 and 9. It's not just English. In French, 69. In German, 69. You never say 7, 2, and 60. So what the church did was it compressed these two. It really is saying after 17 weeks, I'll translate, after 49 weeks, we have Cyrus. And after a subsequent 434 years, you have an anointed one, which is the priesthood cut off. But they have to conflate it. So they remove the semicolon and they put in a comma. Now, here is the craziness. I don't think you have it, but if you have it, I'd be blown away impressed. We don't prepare for our shows, so we just wing it. If you had an actual King James from the 1611, and I discuss this extensively in Volume 1, Let's Get Biblical, and I have a picture. I have the 1611 King James. If you had I don't know if you can do this online or whatever.
I have it online. I have the 1800 version, but I have that. I can get it online.
If you could, you could pull it up online. The actual 1611.
Daniel 9, verse 25.
Right. In the 1611 King James, not in the 19th century King James, not in an 18th century King James, but the original 1611. In 1911, they actually pulled out the plates and republished it.
Yeah, this Bible is not, and all the King James only churches do not use this Bible anymore. It's not not even readable. Right. But do you want me to read it?
It's barely readable, but this is the mind blower.
I'll show it on the screen while I'm reading it too, so they can see they can see the grammar and everything.
Okay.
Verse 25 says, "Know therefore and understand with a V that from going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks, and 80 and 2 weeks.
Stop right there.
All right.
Stop right there. What happens after 7 weeks? Forget the crazy spelling that it's a U instead of a V. What do you see there?
80 and 2 weeks.
Well, before 3 stores, there is
the Prince and the Messiah.
There's an unambiguous grammatical notation. It's in a Snachtan Hebrew, and what is it in the grammar there? There's a semicolon. Do you see that?
Oh yeah.
Thank you. There's a semicolon, which means it's a stop, full-blown stop. So from the going forth of the word, listen, my friends, like you've never, from the going forth of the word, which means from the L'charvot Yerushalayim, go back to Daniel 9, verse 1 and 2, from the destruction of the first temple until an anointed one, a prince, the Messiah, the prince, how the King James translated, will be 7 weeks. Stop. There's a semicolon there. Because in 1611, they didn't come up with this whole deal. Now, they wanted you to think that's talking about Jesus, because that already goes back to the 2nd century, but they never thought of compressing the 2 periods. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to open up a modern King James. That means not the 1611. Let's go to the one that was just published yesterday.
Okay.
And notice.
Wow.
Thank you.
7 weeks, comma, no semicolon.
Right. You see what happened is
crazy.
That means, and just think about this for a moment. In what universe do you say 69 by saying 7, 60, and 2? That's ridiculous. And to prove it further, look at Daniel 9, verse 26, the next passage, just so you want to make sure that Rabbi Singer is not some fanatic who hates Christianity and is coming on air in order to just so you know for sure that Daniel is interested in this, Gabriel speaking here, that Daniel's interested in conveying a 62-week period. Look at verse 26. What does it say there?
And after 62 weeks shall
it doesn't say after 7, 62. It says after 62 weeks, after 62 weeks. 62 times 7 is 434. Bingo. So when I said to you at the beginning of the broadcast that this is going to make a humongous difference, whether you're using a 1611 King James or 2022 King James, I wasn't exaggerating. So you need to ask the Christian, how do you play with this? And we have 2 anointed ones here, one after 7 weeks, I mean 49 years, Cyrus the Great. How do you know he's the Messiah? It says so in Isaiah 45, verse 1. It's really, really famous. By the way, we've talked about this in the past. The people who were Trump supporters said, Cyrus is a picture of Trump, and had the coin of, because Trump was president number 45.
I have that coin, actually.
Yeah. So that's how it's kind of. So there are 2 different anointed ones. What the church does is it tries to compress it. There are more problems here than you can imagine, because as it turns out, if you say that the anointed one who's cut off is Jesus crucified according to Christian tradition, either in the year 30 or the year 33. Well, that's not when the temple's destroyed. That means if, let's say Jesus crucified the year 30, probably, it's not a consensus, but let's say most say 30. So from 30 to 70, is that a half a week? What's the half a week? Like, what happened? That means from the time Jesus is executed by crucifixion in the year 30 until the destruction of the Second Temple is 40 years. 40 years is 5.5 weeks. It doesn't work. The whole thing completely collapses.
Wow.
But wow is right. So what happens is the whole thing doesn't work, because remember, look very careful at Daniel 9, verse 26. There's a prediction of the destruction. The people of the prince will come. That's Rome. And they will destroy what? The city and the sanctuary. This is not like Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the destruction of the sanctuary. We know when that happened, in the year 70.
Yeah.
Really, it doesn't work. Whereas if it's a half a week prior to destruction of the temple, that's the year 66. One point that's going to come up, people are going to ask this question, so I want to head it off. the chronology of Herodotus for the period of the Persian Empire, which means the length of the Second Temple. I don't want to get too advanced in this, and the Jewish chronology are very different here. The Herodotus is he's either called the father of history, or as Xenophon fondly refers to him, and Cicero as the father of lies. If you read any,
he does make up a lot of stuff.
It's insane stuff.
I'll give you an example. He says the people in the north are called the Hyperboreans, and they have one eye. They're like little tiny guys with one eye on their forehead, and they have gold guarding griffins that fly around, flying lions.
That's right.
And then he said that King Cyrus got killed for going up into the land of the Scythians, and some thrill chop his head off. Which other historians are like, what? That didn't happen. So yeah, that's just to give some examples.
There are this is
he's a good geographer.
Historians refer to Herodotus as words, but just completely insane. If you read, you could pick any article on Herodotus, any encyclopedia you want. I'm making this up. I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing I'm fairly confident within 75 words, it's going to talk about Herodotus's lies and all the problems with Herodotus. Just stuff, right?
Have you seen one of his maps? He makes a map of the world. It's a little circle.
Right.
It's like it's just a little circle. It's like
There are places he said he's been where we know he hasn't been. There are whole dissertations been written, not one, thousands of dissertations.
He said the Arabians worship Dionysus. What?
Right. I mean, it's not that he made a mistake. I mean, this is the ancient world. No. So there's a fair consensus that he was just bat nuts out of his mind and just made up stuff, and he was lying through his teeth.
Yeah.
I mean,
this was going for
Yeah. So I want to explain this point. So there is a considerable difference between, and I write about this in Lexical Biblical Volume 1. There's a considerable difference of the Jewish chronology of the length of the Persian Empire and the secular chronology, which relies on Herodotus. We don't. So just so you understand this. So the period, therefore, the period that we're discussing here is a 490-year period, 70 plus 420, and the anointed one who's cut off is my great-great-grandfather, and that's the priesthood. The term cut off, not Yikares, means cut off, removed. It could be killed. It doesn't mean that. If he wanted to say killed, it'll be Yahare would be killed. Doesn't say that at all. And that happens when a half a week. If you ask Christians, by the way, what do you do with the last week? They have no clue. If you ask the Christian, but wait, there's another week and then there's a half a week, when did that week happen? There's no answer. How is it that Jesus was crucified in the year 30, but the sanctuary is destroyed 40 years later when you have a prophecy that happens immediately after? There is no possible answer. I'll tell you this, I did the forensics on this. It means I wanted to find out who started this, who made this, who came up with the idea? Because as I mentioned at the outset, the Daniel 9, this whole thing with the dating is not in the Christian Bible. They didn't think of this stuff. They didn't come up with this one. And it basically comes down to the time of Irenaeus, meaning basically late 2nd century.
Yeah, you could tell, yeah.
Right.
But it's funny because it almost makes you wonder if after the temple's already destroyed, Paul writes his stuff. Paul doesn't do any of this stuff. He doesn't even get into the years or nothing. So you know that Paul is not talking about this or thinking about this, like you mentioned before. But it makes you wonder if going forward, the church or early Christians are looking back in the text and trying to plug these numbers in. Because they're like, okay, Jesus, well, the destruction of the temple is sort of close to when he was crucified, 40 years, give or take. Oh, he was probably born at the year 1 then, which wasn't the year 1. I'm just saying that just so we can understand. The year 1 didn't happen for 700 years. What is it like? It's way later. Anyways, they're probably making these dates fit, and we don't even know when Jesus was born. If he was born in 4 BC, he had to have been at least born in 4 BC because that's when Herod died.
Matthew.
Yeah,
right. But so like have to be.
So the numbers don't even match.
Less than 2, right?
Right.
So Matthew. Right.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying. That's what I'm getting at.
Right. Right. The guy who invented our year, that means like we're in 2022. Like who came up with that, and when did people start using that? So it was a 6th century monk. His name was Dionysius Exiguus, which literally means Danny the dwarf. I have no idea how that happened. That was his name.
And that's what what he was doing. He was trying to make the numbers fit to 70.
Right.
Which he was close, but it just doesn't match. It's just it's literally impossible.
I don't envy him because, as it turns out, as you know, Matthew and Luke date Jesus' birth of more than a decade apart. As you mentioned, Matthew has Jesus born while Herod the Great is still alive, and Herod the Great is saying in Matthew's infancy narrative that look, kill all the kids who are 2 years older and younger. So therefore, 6 BCE would be. I had a rabbi who once said, "Isn't it interesting that according to Matthew, Jesus was born 6 years before Christ?" But that's a whole different joke. According to, it's so crazy. According to Luke, Jesus was born during the time that the governor of Syria took over from Herod Archelaus, Uranus. So that's the year 6 CE. We know that. So they're actually 11 years apart. There's no year 0. So, I mean, what was Dionysius Exiguus going to come up with? I mean, this is 6th century. I mean, the lights went out in the 6th century. Kudos to you for trying to come up. He's basically trying to do a Tatian, a diatessaron where he's trying to merge everything together. Doesn't work. He tried his best.
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to say. Like, it's one of those things that you look at and you're like, wow, they almost made that fit. They almost did, but it's like, but once you look at it, once you actually get to the numbers and you actually plug in the numbers, look at Matthew, when he was born, when all this happened, you're like, no, it's impossible. It literally is impossible for this to fit. And then you would have to ask yourself this question. If it's so close, it's so close. Well, we're talking about God here. Is God going to be close? Is he going to be a couple of years off? Or is he going to be, this is going to be right on? So it can't be that way. It's close enough. Come on, we're off 4 years, 3 years here. No, it doesn't work that way. It's not right. It's not on.
Right. I'm heating up your point. So it's not just a matter of how much time. So 11 years, let's stop being so picky-hewn. It's 2 different periods. Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE. His son, Herod Archelaus, takes over and he governs over Judea. Herod the Great was insane. He was a maniac. His son was crazier than his dad.
Yeah.
Was totally insane. That fits into Matthew where Joseph is born. Don't go back to Bethlehem. Herod Archelaus was so crazy that he was too nuts and too anti-Jewish and too violent for the Romans, and they fired him. This is the very big point. So
they were just the puppets of Augustus.
Right. That means they're all puppets. These are not really the king of the Jews. They call themselves that. They all are answering to the Emperor of Rome. But as far as the Emperor of Rome is going, call yourself what you want. I don't just pay the taxes and you're fine. That's what's going on. So Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE. Herod Archelaus takes over the region called Judea, which essentially is everything south of Jerusalem. Herod Archelaus was a psychopath, definitely inherited his father's craziness. There was no Haldol, there was no lithium at the time, and he went berserk, and ultimately it was a slaughter of Jews in the temple in the year 6 CE over a Passover massacre. The Romans go, you are crazy. I mean, imagine if you are so nuts that you're too crazy for the Romans. And the Roman says, Herod Archelaus, you're out. Right. And he's fired. This is like very well known. Yeah. And then he brings in, and he goes, let's take that Gentile from Syria, who's the governor there, Uranus, and bring him in. And then he not only has Syria, but he also governs now over Judea. Okay, so we know when that happened. I mean, they can't be the same. It's not
that's 6
years. Right, exactly. We know when all that happens. We have multiple sources on this. So this is not like, and of course, Matthew and Luke go in 2 different directions.
Right.
Luke has the family, start off in Nazareth and then go to Bethlehem because of the census. That's the whole plot device that Luke is using following the birth of Jesus. He's not born at home, as in Matthew. He's born in a manger because there's no room at the inn. I just heard a Christian apologist, I'm not going to say who, but he's a fairly well-known guy, say in a debate with a really well-known non-Christian New Testament scholar that the Mary and Joseph had two homes. I'm not kidding. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to embarrass anyone.
Yeah.
Okay, so I need to say this because I don't know if anyone's going to say this. You need to know this because I just saw this in the debate that just occurred like a month ago. I'm not naming names because it doesn't interest me. So what happens is the non-Christian New Testament scholar said correctly that Mary and Joseph, in Luke's view, start off, their home is in Nazareth. The census forces them to move to Bethlehem. Why? Because Joseph is a descendant of King David. Okay? Just look at Luke chapter 1, verse 27. Okay? It's really right there. Okay? Now, they then, after the child is born, and they then go back to Jerusalem. Just so you know, if you draw a line from Nazareth to Bethlehem, it would basically pass through Jerusalem. The distance is not that far. Let's say it's 90 miles, something like that. Okay, so she then, after the month period, she then brings the necessary offerings in the temple and then heads back home. In Matthew, it's entirely reversed. The family is originally from Bethlehem, and then the family has to go down to Egypt and wait to the death of Herod, and then Joseph is born. You can't go back home because the new guy, Herod Archelaus, is crazier than his dad, and therefore they go to Nazareth. I saw this in a debate with this Christian, who's a knowledgeable guy, this Christian apologist, answered this by saying that actually Mary and Joseph had two homes. They had one home in Nazareth and another home in Bethlehem. Okay. And I'm sorry that the non-Christian didn't respond, but he should have responded. Yeah. That's completely ridiculous. Why? Because see Luke chapter 2, verse 7. It says in Luke, remember, they don't have a home in Luke. I'm giving this all away. They don't have a home in Bethlehem. Joseph and Mary are from Nazareth. And there's no room at the hotel, at the inn.
Right. When they go to their house,
born in a manger. Right. Now I was watching it and rooting and going, wait, they couldn't have had two homes. The whole point of Luke is that Jesus was born in the most distressed, the most humble place possible, a place where horses eat from, a manger, a trough. And why, Luke says? Because there's no room at the inn, there's no room at the hotel. But if, as the Christians say, that Mary and Joseph had two homes, one in the Galilee and one in Judea and Bethlehem, why would they have to go into a barn to give birth? Why don't you just give birth in your home? And I'm sorry that the non-Christian didn't get that one.
Yeah, that's very obvious. That's like,
right.
Gotta be a brain scientist to figure that one out.
Right. So in Bethlehem, notice, and therefore you can project from that. So Matthew, would we expect in the book of Matthew to have any mention of a manger? No, because their home is in Bethlehem. That's what that's the starting point. What's happening essentially is Matthew and Luke are independently inventing two different infancy narratives, or collecting an oral tradition of the infancy narrative in two different places and come up with two separate incompatible devices to get Jesus to be born in the city in which King David was born. King David was born in Bethlehem, see 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 58. So, but they independently come up with this. So this is an L source and an M source, and then the whole thing explodes, but it's too late to rectify, because people think that, like, at the end of the first century, people had a Bible like we have together. No, there were certain communities that had the book of Luke, some communities that only had the book of Mark, and some only Matthew. By the time you get to the second century, it's too late. And by the time Irenaeus, the bishop of Lyon, saying these are the four, that's it, it's all locked up. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, there's a lot. I just learned a lot in this.
Wasn't that intense?
Yeah.
Right. And it turns out, I won't name names, but there are Christian evangelical scholars who, to their credit, can see that these are completely incompatible.
Yep. Oh, yeah, I've talked to those people.
Yeah, I don't want, but they know this can't work,
Right.
and therefore the entire it's very obvious what's happening here. What's happening in Daniel 9 is they already have an idea, and then there's a bias confirmation, which means they want to have Daniel 9 predict the date of Jesus' crucifixion. They don't care how it's done, and then they go back, scour through text, and then twist the passages, change the anointed to capital M, Messiah, put the definite article, it doesn't exist there, and then just chop it up, take out the semicolon. That's done somewhere between 1611 now. It's done in the 19th century, and then the semicolon, poof, just disappears. There is the unambiguous grammatical device called an esnachta, which is there. And if you're going, well, the esnachta was invented by the Masoretes, I mean, it's a grammatical device. If you think that the Masoretes just made it up, in what universe is 7, 60, and 2 the way you say 69? And in case you're saying, I don't believe Rabbi Singer, just look at Daniel 9, verse 26. It says, after the 62 weeks. It doesn't say after the 69 weeks. Bingo, dead, it's over. This is why Christians do not teach their children the Hebrew language, despite the fact that Christians believe that the Hebrew language was used to convey eternal oracles. I mean, Christians could do exactly what the Jewish people can do, and that is enough with the Latin and teach biblical Hebrew to young boys and girls. They don't. If Christians could read the Jewish Bible in its original language, they'd be leaving the church. Now, Christians can study Hebrew as an adult, go to college, take biblical Hebrew. It takes years. I mean, when you're an adult, language doesn't come to you. But by then it's too late. You already bought into the system. And then you're reading everything through a Christologic grid, and it becomes really very difficult. But this is why, Christian schools for kids, they're not teaching Hebrew to the kids. You want to take biblical Hebrew at Fuller Theological, Dallas Theological, Lutheran Bible Institute? You're 19, you're 20 years old. I mean, if you want to be pastor, I don't know how many semesters you got to do of biblical Hebrew. You're not going to be. You could barely make out a word. So
right.
You're done. You're smoked. You're fried. You have no chance at all. And that, I think, I think that's why the King James only. That's where they get their traction from. Why would anyone believe that that folks from the Church of England, that 47 men in good standing from the Church of England, that they would write something as divinely inspired? And to their credit, even though it's easy to mock the idea, because they don't have a holy language, the King James has come to replace their holy language.
Right.
Because they have no access to the Hebrew. I mean, even if you think that a movement is insane, like a King James only, it sounds crazy, you do have to ask the question, but what is generating this excitement? What is the spark? And if they don't have access to a holy language, then what happens is then the King James and the kind of Jacobean English, it's not really anymore because it's been cleaned up a lot.
Yeah.
It's that King thou art, and so on. Verily I say unto you, words that are.
It gives people something to think of.
That becomes the holy language.
Yes.
That's what's really going on.
It's Shakespeare too. It's Shakespeare language. And that's what's so funny about it. It's like it becomes, like you said, it's the archaic English language.
Do you know when the King James was written, there were no Jews in England? The Jews, there was not a single Jew in England in 1611.
Wow.
The Jews had been expelled centuries earlier. There were no Jews there. None. Not a Jew to be found in England. Jews would not return to England until 40 years after the death of Shakespeare. Shakespeare is alive during the time when the King James Bible is published.
Yeah.
As I said, just a dozen years after the Merchant. I mean, he's writing the Merchant of Venice, having Shakespeare never met a Jew in his life.
Right.
Never. Neither did Calvin.
He was part of the Kingsmen, which was
right.
He was funded by King James. It was in the same court, and it had Shakespeare and all the plays that we know, all the Macbeth and all those from like 1604 to 1610, around the same time they're writing the King James Bible. It's all happening in the same decade.
I want to just submit one other thing for evangelicals to consider. Just ponder about this. Evangelical Christians are not fond of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. They consider the Mormons to be a cult.
Right.
I'm not making this up for those who are not familiar with this.
Oh, yeah.
If you ever refer to
they call them cults.
Mormon, right? If you ever refer to a Mormon as a Christian in the presence of an evangelical or a Roman Catholic, they'll say they are not Christians. They're called a cult. They can't stand them. Right. Not personally, but theologically, they can't stand it. You can call a Catholic a Christian in front of a Baptist, and you can get away with that, but you will never get away with calling a Mormon a Christian. Like Senator Orrin Hatch just passed away. They would never refer to him as a Christian because he was a Mormon. Okay, now I want you to listen very carefully. I've never said this publicly. If you ask an evangelical Christian, why don't you believe in the Church of the Latter-day Saints? What's wrong with it? So they would give you a whole list of problems with it. They would say that it's incompatible with the teachings of the New Testament, the Book of Mormon. They would say that Joseph Smith is whatever. He was quite a prankster and so on, blah, 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 a whole bunch of. But in that list, evangelicals say to you that in the Book of Mormon, a ton of the Jewish Bible is quoted. That means the Hebrew Bible is quoted all over the place. More than 20 chapters of the book of Isaiah appears in the Book of Mormon. And guess what? In the Book of Mormon, which version of the Bible is used was revealed to Joseph Smith through the angel Moroni. The King James Version, the 1611 version. And evangelical Christians, this is why I'm appealing to you, the Christian, properly and correctly laugh and go, why would the angel Moroni be quoting the 1611 Bible? Like, did the angels forget Hebrew? Like, why would the angels be quoting the 1611?
Yeah.
I'm not making this. So this is like a big deal because all over the Book of Mormon, huge swaths of passages all over the Jewish Bible is quoted, and it's straight King James.
Yeah.
King James 1611. And evangelicals, this is why I appeal to the evangelical, use that critical thinking when you start quoting Septuagints. Use that critical thinking when you start quoting King James. I mean, if you understand that the Book of Mormon is a book that does not deserve your respect, attention, should not be used, should not be relied upon, is not credible for many reasons, including that it's using the King James Version, then apply that in the same way and go, holy moly, why would I think that the writers of the New Testament are relying on the Septuagint?
Right.
So just like, wake up. And people don't think about
That's such a good point. Yeah.
Right. Like you're rejecting all these other iterations of Christianity, then use the same critical thinking and apply it to what you belong to, apply it to your iteration of Christianity and go, what? Being the Holy Spirit was using the Septuagint to inform Matthew how to write Matthew 1:23. Really? Like God, the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, just forgot how to read Hebrew and decided to be reading from a translation? Does that make sense to anyone?
Shouldn't. This is clearly written for a different purpose, and it's being repurposed by Christians, tweaked, even changed and altered in some areas. For example, capitalizing letters and changing stuff. And you can see clearly that it just doesn't match. It doesn't, like, check the numbers. The numbers don't match up. But for what you were saying in the beginning, it does match up, where you talk about the temple actually being destroyed and the priesthood being cut down.
That's right. It matches precisely with history. And I want to convey this again. Many New Testament scholars, even though I've done shows with them, and they're much nicer than I am about this. I mean, they go, well, it had some way. No, we're not talking about, there was a wrong approach or whatever. This is chicanery. This is the kind of stuff that if you're an attorney in the United States and you played with a contract and that was discovered, you'd be disbarred for that. You'd be thrown in prison in the United States or any civilized country for engaging in this kind of tampering with contracts. And this is not an ordinary, this is not a real estate contract. You believe the word of God. What does that say to you? I mean, why would you play with the word of God?
And not only, and even outside of the Bible, like when you get the Josephus, the famous text about Josephus with the testimony in Flavianum, we know that's been altered and interpolated and even basically just hacked up. And like you get other areas where Eusebius just makes up stories that didn't happen. Once you like you were mentioning, this was in a court case. There'd be people going to jail over this. You would be no longer a credible witness. There's nothing you could say anymore that we should listen to. You're getting caught all over the place. You're getting caught with the Bible. You're getting caught outside the Bible. The church is all corrupt. Like it just doesn't look like if this is the real religion of a real God, you would think there would be some order going on here and not just a bunch of criminals making stuff up, getting caught left and right.
You're raising a very, very hot item, and that's Testimonium Flavium, Antiquities 1833.
Right.
The reason why this is insane that you brought that up, because this is amping it up further. Here, all scholars, Christian or non-Christian, concede that this text has been completely corrupted. Right. The only argument is it a complete invention? That means the whole thing about Jesus being Christ, who was a man, if you can call him a man. It means everyone agrees that this has been corrupted. This is not like some people going around, no, Josephus was really a Christian. 0 people say that. I mean, you have to really be drinking an enormous amount of propofol. I don't know if you could drink it. I mean, you have no idea how much Johnny Walker you have to drink to consume to believe that. I mean, Josephus wasn't
the Nicene Creed. It's literally the Nicene Creed just injected into the text. Exactly. And what's so crazy about this, though, is that we all, even scholars and atheists and critical scholars, we all, and believers alike, all of us, when we talk about this testimony in Flavianum, and we can get into this more on another day, but just real quick, what blows my mind, and I don't understand this, I literally, to this day, I'm like in shock that we talk about this like it's not that big of a deal. Like, yeah, they just altered the text a little bit. But, you know, it's like, wait, hold up. Pause it for a second. This should be like all over the place. Like it doesn't matter if it was originally some skeleton version of this or not. Whether it's all invented and all forged completely or if it's interpolated, that is a big deal. That should be like, holy crap, the church is messing around and trying to change things. If this is all true, they shouldn't have to do anything. Let the word be the word and let God do his thing. Why do you have to do all these extra stuff? Right? That's what I'm getting at.
Right. So here's where it goes. If Christian scribes were perfectly willing to corrupt their own New Testament, for example, add in 12 verses at the end of the book of Mark, because Mark has no appearances, resurrection appearances. It ends at chapter 16, verse 8. If they're willing to mess with their own New Testament, adding in the story of the adulterous woman in the book of John, to add in Luke 22:19, half of that passage and all of verse 20 is added in because Luke didn't have the Eucharist, doesn't have vicarious atonement, so therefore it wanted to. If they're willing to mess with their own Christian Bible, what do you think they would do to Josephus? Like, Josephus is not considered a holy book to them, right? And incidentally, loads of church fathers quoted Josephus. Origen was a genius. Origen was a 3rd century church father, no doubt the brightest of all.
He didn't even know that verse was there.
He wouldn't. That means he's quoting Josephus up and down. This is 3rd century. Origen, just so you know, was only one of 2 church fathers that was completely fluent in Hebrew. Only him and Jerome.
Yeah.
Origen really was a genius. He was a prodigy in his teens already. Jerome says that he wrote 2,000 books in his life. That might be an exaggeration, but he was really quite. He knew Josephus backwards and forwards. He didn't think that was important enough. Moreover, Origen says in his commentary on Matthew chapter 16 that Josephus was not a Christian.
Yeah, he says, too bad he didn't believe in Jesus.
Right. He said he says that. It means 0 church fathers, nobody, and suddenly at the same time of the Council of Nicaea, approximately, you see, as you said, the historian of the church.
Right.
He is the one who's responsible for inserting testimony in Flavium. But this shouldn't come to surprise to anyone, because you have a criminal endeavor already changing the Hebrew Bible in order to make it appear Christological, changing the Christian Bible in order so that Mark matches Matthew. And that's why, my friends, Luke didn't believe in vicarious atonement, didn't believe that Jesus died as a sin offering, as a ransom for your sins. And that's why you'll have in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, and Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, the reference to Jesus died as a ransom for your sins, but appears nowhere in the book of Luke, because Luke didn't believe in that. And therefore they had to corrupt Luke 22 in order so that the Eucharist of Luke matches Matthew and Mark. Exactly. If they would do that to their own Bible, what do you think they would do to Josephus? I mean, this is a no-brainer.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ואת נעשה